What if I told you that some of the most resourceful cooking in Japan happens not in professional kitchens or cozy family homes, but on the streets under bridges and inside makeshift shelters built from blue tarps? Japan has a reputation for precision, cleanliness, and culinary excellence. From meticulously crafted bento boxes to world-class ramen shops, food culture here is serious business. So, when you look at how Japan's homeless population, known locally as Furosha or Nojukusha, manages to feed themselves without access to any conventional cooking setup, you start to see something genuinely remarkable. This is not just a story about survival. It is a story about ingenuity, dignity, and a deeply human relationship with food that persists even in the harshest of circumstances. And what you are about to discover might completely change how you think about cooking itself. Before we talk about the cooking, we need to understand who these people actually are. Japan's homeless population, called Nojukusha in Japanese, which literally translates to outdoor sleepers, is statistically smaller than in many other developed countries. Official government surveys have placed the number somewhere in the low tens of thousands, though many researchers and advocacy groups suggest the real number, including hidden homelessness, is significantly higher. The majority of Japan's visible homeless population consists of middle-aged to elderly men, many of whom lost their footing economically during Japan's extended economic stagnation following the bubble burst of the early 1990s, a period often called the Lost Decade or Ushinawareda Junin. These individuals tend to cluster in specific urban areas. Parks in major cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya become de facto communities. In Tokyo, places like Ueno-koen, Shinjuku, and along the Sumida River have historically housed significant encampments. In Osaka, the Kamagasaki district, also known as Irinchiku, is famous as one of the largest day laborer and homeless communities in all of Japan. Many residents here have deep roots in manual labor and construction work, and they bring a practical, problem-solving mindset into every aspect of daily survival, including food preparation. These communities are not random. They are organized, sometimes surprisingly so, with unwritten rules, social hierarchies, and shared resources. Understanding this social structure is actually the foundation for understanding how cooking without a kitchen becomes possible. And speaking of shared resources, the next thing you need to understand is just how creatively these communities source their food in the first place. You cannot cook what you do not have, so sourcing food is the first and perhaps most critical skill in the homeless cooking ecosystem. In Japan, this happens through several distinct channels. The most well-known is dumpster diving, which the Japanese call gomi asari, or literally garbage searching. Japan's food waste situation is paradoxical. The country throws away enormous quantities of perfectly edible food every single day, largely due to strict cosmetic standards and sell-by-date regulations that are often far more conservative than necessary. Convenience stores, called konbini in Japanese, are particularly notable here. Chains like 7-Eleven, Lawson, and Family Mart pull enormous quantities of food off their shelves daily, and while policies vary by location, much of this food historically ended up in dumpsters rather than food banks. Experienced Nojukusha learn the schedules of nearby stores and restaurants. They know exactly when restocking happens, when old inventory gets pulled, and which locations are more likely to yield useful finds. This is not random scavenging. It is a practiced, almost professional routine built on observation and timing. Beyond dumpster diving, there are community food distributions called takidashi, which translates roughly to cooked food giveaway. These are organized by volunteer groups, religious organizations, and NPOs who gather in parks on designated days to distribute hot meals, rice, vegetables, and sometimes clothing. Takidashi events are a lifeline, but they do not happen every day, and they cannot be relied upon as a sole source of nutrition. Some individuals supplement their food supply by collecting aluminum cans, known as can, which they sell by weight to recycling dealers. This small income can fund purchases at hyaku-en shops, which are 100-yen stores, or from discount bins at supermarkets. The combination of these methods creates a surprisingly functional food supply chain, but having food is only half the equation. The real question is, what happens next? And the answer involves some genuinely clever improvised cooking technology. Cooking without a kitchen starts with solving the fire problem. Open flames in public parks are illegal in Japan, and authorities do occasionally crack down on encampments, so the people who cook outdoors have developed methods that balance functionality with discretion. The most common improvised cooking device is a variation of what might be called a kama, the traditional Japanese word for a cooking pot or stove. Makeshift versions are often constructed from large tin cans, metal drums, or salvaged sheet metal, bent and shaped into a functional firebox. One particularly clever design involves nesting two large cans together with ventilation holes, punched at the base to allow airflow. Fuel goes inside, and the top acts as a cooking surface. This design, sometimes called a rocket stove in Western survival communities, is remarkably fuel efficient because the airflow draws heat upward very effectively. The fuel itself tends to be whatever burns cleanly enough to be useful without attracting too much attention. Dry wood scraps from construction sites, cardboard packed tightly to burn slowly, and even dried leaves pressed into compact forms are all used. Charcoal, called sumi in Japanese, is prized when obtainable because it burns hot, clean, and with relatively little visible smoke. Some of the more established encampments, particularly those that have existed in the same location for years without major disruption, have constructed what can only be described as outdoor kitchens. These are semi-permanent structures with designated fire pits, ventilation, and even basic windbreaks. The level of engineering in some of these setups is genuinely impressive, reflecting years of refinement. Fire is solved, heat is available, but what gets cooked on these improvised stoves might surprise you even more. The food that gets cooked in these outdoor kitchens reflects both the constraints of the situation and the deep cultural preferences of the people cooking it. Japan has a food culture so deeply embedded in its social identity that even in the most difficult circumstances, people try to maintain some connection to familiar flavors and cooking traditions. Rice, gohan in Japanese, is the absolute cornerstone. Even in homeless communities, rice remains the primary staple. Getting rice is not always easy, but it appears regularly at takadashi distributions and can be purchased cheaply in small quantities. Cooking rice without a proper rice cooker or suihanki requires skill. The traditional method of cooking rice in a pot over open flame, watching for steam and timing the reduction of heat perfectly, is actually a well-established technique in Japanese culinary history, and many older men in these communities learned it before electric appliances became universal. Alongside rice, miso soup called miso shiru appears frequently. Miso paste, or miso jiru no moto, keeps for a long time without refrigeration, and combined with hot water and whatever vegetables or tofu are available, it produces something nutritious, warming, and deeply comforting. The dashi broth base, typically made from dried fish flakes called katsuo bushi, or dried kelp called konbu, provides depth of flavor even with minimal ingredients. Vegetables tend to be whatever is available. Daikon radish, cabbage, burdock root called gobo, and sweet potatoes are common because they are cheap, durable, and satisfying. These ingredients get stewed, simmered, or roasted directly in coals when the situation calls for it. Protein is the trickier element. Eggs, called tamako in Japanese, are affordable and calorie-dense. Tofu is another affordable protein source. On better days, small portions of fish might be available, either purchased cheaply at closing time supermarket discounts or received through distributions. The resulting meals are simple but genuinely nutritious, and the flavors are recognizably, distinctly Japanese. But the cooking techniques themselves are where things get really interesting. Skill matters enormously when you are cooking with limited equipment, inconsistent fuel, and no running water. The techniques used by Japan's street cooks have been honed through necessity, and some of them reflect a kind of practical wisdom that professional chefs would recognize and respect. One fundamental technique is what might be called ichiju sansai cooking, a traditional Japanese meal structure meaning one soup and three sides. This framework is normally associated with formal Japanese cuisine, but its underlying logic, building a nutritionally complete meal from simple components without relying on any single elaborate dish, translates beautifully to outdoor cooking with limited resources. By thinking in terms of a broth-based main and several small complementary components, Cooks can produce balanced meals without needing complex equipment. The low and slow simmering method, juru or niru in Japanese, is particularly important. A wide, shallow pot placed over a modest fire can simmer vegetables and protein together for extended periods, breaking down tougher ingredients and melding flavors without requiring precise temperature control. This is forgiving cooking, which is exactly what you need when your heat source is variable. Steaming, called mushiru in Japanese, is also widely used. A pot of water with a makeshift rack or even a crumpled piece of foil can function as a basic steamer. Steamed vegetables and rice cooked this way retain their nutrients efficiently, and the technique requires relatively little fuel compared to boiling. Another critical technique is mise en place, the practice of having everything prepared and organized before cooking begins. While this is a French term, the concept is deeply embedded in Japanese kitchen culture as well, and becomes even more important when working without a proper prep space. Ingredients are cleaned at a water source, cut with whatever knife is available, and arranged so that the actual cooking period can be short and controlled. The resourcefulness embedded in these techniques tells us something profound about what cooking actually is at its core. But beyond individual skill, there is a whole social dimension to cooking in these communities that changes the picture entirely. Kyoto means cooperation or community in Japanese, and it is a concept that shows up in surprising ways within homeless encampments. While Western narratives about homelessness often emphasize isolation and individual struggle, many Japanese outdoor communities function with a significant degree of collective organization. Cooking is one of the primary expressions of this. In larger encampments, communal cooking arrangements develop naturally. One person might be particularly skilled at making rice or preparing miso soup, and they take on that role for a group. Another person might specialize in sourcing vegetables or building and maintaining the fire. These roles are informal but consistent, reflecting a kind of natural division of labor. The sharing of meals, called meshiagaru, or more casually tabaru, carries significant social weight in Japanese culture. Eating together is not a trivial act. It signals trust, belonging, and mutual recognition of one another's humanity. In encampments where life can feel dehumanizing and invisible, the act of sitting down together over a shared pot of soup carries emotional and psychological weight that goes well beyond its nutritional function. There are also older men within many communities who become known as particularly good cooks and who teach others. This informal knowledge transmission keeps culinary skills alive within the community and ensures that as populations within encampments change, the practical knowledge of how to cook well under these conditions does not disappear. This communal dimension is beautiful in its own right, but it also raises a fascinating question. How do these communities handle the hygiene and food safety challenges that come with cooking outdoors without running water or refrigeration? Food safety without refrigeration, running water, or conventional kitchen hygiene tools is a genuine challenge, and it is one that Japan's outdoor cooks approach with practical seriousness. Contaminated food can cause serious illness, and getting sick while homeless is an especially dangerous situation given limited access to medical care. The first and most important principle is cook everything thoroughly. Low and slow simmering kills pathogens. Anything that might be questionable in terms of freshness gets cooked at sustained high temperatures for extended periods. Raw preparations are largely avoided unless the ingredients are absolutely, verifiably fresh. Water is another critical issue. The word for safe water in Japanese, anzen no mizu, is something that community members think about constantly. Public parks in Japan typically have water access points called suido or mizuba, and these become essential infrastructure. Water for cooking is boiled first as a matter of course. Pots, bowls, and utensils are rinsed with boiling water when possible. Food that cannot be cooked immediately is generally consumed right away rather than stored, because without refrigeration, the safest food is the food that was just prepared. Seasonality plays an important role too. In Japan's hot and humid summer months, called natsu, food spoils quickly, and the outdoor cooks adapt by focusing on dishes that can be made and eaten in single sessions. In winter, called fuyu, the cold itself becomes a temporary refrigerator of sorts, and larger batches can be made and kept safely overnight. The sophistication of these adaptations is genuine, and it speaks to a level of food safety knowledge that rivals what you would expect in a basic culinary course. These solutions are impressive on their own terms, but what really elevates the story is the emotional and cultural dimension of what cooking means to the people doing it. Nihon no kokoro means the heart of Japan, and it is a phrase that captures something essential about how Japanese people relate to their cultural identity. Food is central to this identity in ways that are almost impossible to overstate. For many of the men living in Japan's outdoor communities, cooking familiar Japanese dishes is not just about nutrition. It is about maintaining a sense of self, of belonging to a cultural tradition, of being Japanese in a meaningful way, even when society has largely rendered them invisible. An older man carefully preparing dashi broth from dried fish flakes over a can stove is doing something that connects him to his childhood, to his mother's cooking, to every meal he has ever eaten that made him feel at home. This is why, even in the most difficult circumstances, you find people making the effort to cook properly rather than simply eating whatever raw food is available. The extra effort required to make a proper bowl of miso shiru or a pot of properly seasoned rice is worth it, because the result is not just food, it is continuity, it is dignity, it is identity made edible. Japanese food culture also places great value on the concept of umami, the fifth taste associated with depth, savoriness, and satisfaction. Even in minimal cooking conditions, experienced outdoor cooks find ways to introduce umami through dried mushrooms, miso, soy sauce called shoyu, or whatever dashi-producing ingredients they can access. The presence of this flavor dimension transforms a meal from mere sustenance into something genuinely satisfying and culturally meaningful. There is also something worth noting about the Japanese concept of mottainai, which expresses a sense of regret over waste. This philosophy of using everything fully and wasting nothing finds its most literal expression in outdoor cooking, where every ingredient is genuinely precious, and zero-waste cooking is not a fashionable trend, but an absolute necessity. This connection to deep cultural values is remarkable, but it also exists in a complicated relationship with the Japanese state and society, which treats its homeless population in ways that might not be what you expect. Japan's relationship with its homeless population is complicated and often contradictory. On one hand, Japan maintains a strong public image of cleanliness, order, and social cohesion, concepts captured in the cultural values of seiketsu and chitsujo. Visible homelessness sits uneasily within this self-image, and there is significant social pressure, both formal and informal, to make it disappear. On the other hand, Japanese authorities have historically been less aggressive in removing established encampments than you might expect, at least compared to cities like Los Angeles or New York. Encampments in parks like Ueno-koen have been permitted to exist for years, sometimes decades, with a kind of tacit tolerance that reflects the practical reality that there are few alternative solutions being offered. The situation changed significantly around major public events. The preparations for the 2002 FIFA World Cup in Japan, and later the Tokyo 2020 Olympics, which were ultimately held in 2021, triggered significant pressure on authorities to clear visible encampments from prominent public spaces. This displacement, known in advocacy circles as a form of forced removal or kaiosei taishutsu, disrupted the carefully built social ecosystems within these communities, including their communal cooking arrangements, their food sourcing routines, and the informal networks that kept people fed and connected. Welfare programs called seikatsu hogo in Japanese technically provide a safety net, but accessing them involves navigating complex bureaucratic requirements, including having a registered address, which homeless individuals obviously lack. Various advocacy organizations have worked to help people access these programs, but the gap between available support and actual need remains significant. This institutional dimension shapes the material conditions of outdoor cooking in very direct ways, determining where people can set up fires, how long they can stay in one location, and whether the basic infrastructure of park water sources remains accessible. And finally, all of this context leads us to the most profound question of all, which is what this entire phenomenon teaches us about cooking, about community, and about what it means to be human. The story of how Japan's Nojokusha feed themselves, is ultimately a story about what cannot be taken away. Equipment can be removed, shelter can be demolished, and social status can be stripped down to nothing. But the knowledge of how to feed yourself and the people around you, the instinct to turn whatever is available into something warm and nourishing and shared, that persists. It persists across cultures and centuries, and it persists in the parks and under the bridges of Tokyo and Osaka today, one improvised pot of miso shiru at a time. Cooking without a kitchen is not a limitation of human creativity. It is an expression of it. Japan's outdoor cooking communities prove that the most essential ingredient in any meal has never been the kitchen itself. It has always been the person standing over the heat, paying attention, and caring enough to make something worth eating. That is something worth remembering the next time you open a fully stocked refrigerator and wonder what to make for dinner.